my position. Question for Sarah, and it's probably a really, really unfair question. I mean, that was fascinating, and it will be really interesting to see where that project goes. I think, well, the question really is there a risk that in revealing and digging into this complexity, that you simply end up with something which is a rabbit hole to go down and becomes a blocker to actual action, or gets put in the too difficult pile, and things carry on as before? How do you avoid that happening? How do you turn this into real practical action?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that's one of the reasons why systems work has come in and out fashion, but never really taken on. I think one of the reasons why at the moment there's a real appetite for this kind of thing is because of the net zero agenda and how much that interlinks all of these systems together and how it's going to impact across so many different things. And I think with this real recognition that many of the actions that we're going to have is going to have an impact across lots of different systems, there is a real appetite for it. I think you're absolutely right. So what we've been finding throughout is that what we do isn't exhaustive. So we've had quite a bit of time, we've had quite a bit of investment from academics, but we know there are loads of interventions we haven't identified. I think the thing about it is to try to design processes that are pragmatic and adaptable to the resource and the input, how open the processes can be, and all of those sort of considerations to make sure that government can actually make use of it, rather than laying out the ideal academic way of doing it if you had infinite time, resources and expertise to use on it. So it's a real challenge, and I think we're going to come up against it when we design this protocol. But actually DEFRA have started doing some of this stuff already within their futures team. And I think their input on how actually they might be able to use it in real life is going to be absolutely essential to make sure that it's something that doesn't just get put on a shelf and not used at all.
Well, that's I think very encouraging. But let's see. Other questions? I have a question, Joe.
Thanks. Hi, Sarah, it's Jo from UE. As a participant in CISRISC, I just wondered, how much does it depend on the individuals who are around the table, the participants? I know you've sort of said it has to be very interdisciplinary, but the specific individuals around the table, is there any sort of sensitivity analysis around if this was run in a parallel universe, for instance, would you end up with completely different outcomes or suggestions?
So yeah, I mean, with this project only being a year long, we don't have the time or the space to sort of run it again with a different set of experts. But some of us have thought about this in some other projects that we've done. And actually, we know that it's highly dependent on who you get involved. And I think, again, one of the things that comes out of that is that, one, the process itself is as important as the outputs. So the people that you have in the room arguably should be some of the people that you need to influence and some of the people that have diverse insights to make sure that the conversations that are happening and the changes in the ways of thinking are just as important as the number of interventions that you've identified and how you implement them. I think this point about who you get in the room is also really key. And one of the things that's happened in past projects where, for example, you've only been able to have policymakers in the room, is to try and get them to think about, to pose questions that allow them to think as if they weren't policymakers, as if they were somebody else with a different perspective, because otherwise you end up with a very narrow set of inputs that really aren't representative at all of the whole system. So I think there is some thinking about it, but again, it's something that's difficult, but I think it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions on noise. So Tim, Hilary, Cerise. One of them is just, is there information about how much the noise levels dropped during the pandemic lockdown periods? I think you sort of said it had, but I wasn't sure how much. And the second question is specifically to Hilary. So it's great to have some better modelling of noise exposures, but I'm wondering how comparable it's going to be with previous modelling or with modelling that's done in Europe. And that's one of the things that having the noise data available means that health people go, oh great, we can use it, and you get a much better insights into the relationships between noise and health. But one of the challenges has been when you've had different modelling approaches. And I remember sort of looking at some of the ENDS data in London, and if you crossed, you know, the one road, you could get an arbitrary between 5 and 10 dB drop because of the difference in models. And that's really tricky to know what to do to if you're trying to do health analyses.
Thank you. So first question, how much did noise drop during the pandemic? There were some studies. I don't think there's been a huge amount published yet. So noise dropped when the traffic dropped. And there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that people could hear the birds. You know, and they want to keep that. And that's still the case around some of the larger airports like Heathrow, where people are not necessarily all looking forward to the recovery of the aviation industry, for example. But it did vary because it didn't just drop uniformly everywhere. If you live next to a road, a major road, it dropped a lot. If you lived on a side road, there was still the same little amount of traffic that there normally was. I don't have any numbers to hand. I know it caused a problem for industry because a lot of big industry kept running through the pandemic, and their permits are linked very much to background noise levels. And when the traffic went away, the background noise level dropped, the industry noise became more noticeable and complaints started. And the industry hadn't done anything different, in their eyes weren't doing anything wrong. But local authorities were inundated with requests to go out, and somebody's nodding in the audience, requests to go out and investigate this new nuisance that had magically appeared overnight. So yes, they definitely dropped, but I can't give you numbers, I'm afraid. Second question, I've forgotten. Oh yes, so short answer, not comparable. Never has been though, so no different in that respect. So round 1 to round 2, the regulations changed the threshold for mapping. So there were a lot of additional sources mapped that hadn't been done in round 1, so you couldn't compare. Round 2 to round 3, we were just coming out of the financial crisis. So airports dropped movements then, for example, so it wasn't necessarily comparable. Round 3 to round 4, we're all changing modelling method. So in the UK, we've used something called CRTN and CRN, calculation of road traffic noise and calculation of rail noise. For round 4, the legislation says we must use the common European mapping method known as Knossos EU. And every other country in the EU used to use their own national methods. They'll all be switching to Knossos EU. But even then, it's not going to be comparable because you've still got flexibility over what sources you choose to include. So some countries will just do major roads, some countries will do all roads, some countries will do a mishmash in between. So the data still won't, even in the European Union, the data won't be comparable. And one of the things we've got to grapple with, I think it was yourself talking this morning about the public messaging. When we publish our results, we'll find that a lot more people are exposed to noise than were in round 3. And that's not necessarily because the noise has got worse. It's because we're mapping a lot more roads and a lot more areas, and we're doing all the smaller towns as well as just the big towns. So there's a lot more of the population that we're looking at. So we've got to make sure we message that properly and say, no, we haven't just doubled the noise exposure across the country. We've doubled the amount of people that we've looked at to see what the exposure is, or tripled, or whatever the numbers turn out to be. Now the hope, certainly for the EU member states, is that round 4 to round 5 will be comparable within each country, because there is no plan to change the modelling methods again. So as long as they pick the same sources to remap, the results will be comparable, but you still get the inter-country differences. And I've mentioned we're reviewing our regs, so I don't know where we're going. For strategic mapping, we'll continue using Knossos for the time being. but the British Standards Committee are looking at developing a new national method to replace CRTN and CRN. So there's a question for us to DEFRA whether we switch to that. Certainly all the local assessments will switch to that when it gets published, which is a number of years off yet.
If I can say a quick word about intercomparability, and this is not about intercomparability of noise maps, but I know that anyone who's had even a passing association with air quality and noise wonders why they're dealt with so differently. And it comes down to the very technical detail of actually how the different assessments are done and the legislation that drives that and so on. I think there's an opportunity now with both advances in data quality and data availability, but also, dare I say it, a potential advantage of Brexit in the UK, we can start bringing the air quality and noise fields closer together and allow us to do those integrated kind of assessments. And hopefully the way that the noise map is being set up will allow that in the future. And I would say that because it's being led by Noise Consultants Limited. Sorry, getting a plug in. Yeah, but I think it's really interesting to see how this is developing and the opportunities there to really start enhancing data and using it for multiple purposes. I think is yeah, it's an exciting one.
Thank you. Oh, we have a question from Robin. Robin's the chair of our policy committee on noise.
I'll start with we've got two questions from the live feed. So where it says a question to Tim, it sounded more like a statement, but I'll let you answer it anyway. You've not mentioned Zoom, which has transformed communication at the same time as COVID. And then he goes on to praise the fact that he can watch this particular event from the comfort of his home. So I don't know whether anybody would like to comment maybe on that and maybe what that might hold for the future. And since I've only got two questions here, I'll do the second one as well, which is probably more towards the DEFRA side, which is interesting to hear about the financial evaluation of noise and health. And so a question really about what changes do you think that might bring? And I'll add my own bit on top of that, which is really, obviously, you've got the IGCBN reporting and quite a lot of work to do to evaluate what comes out of that. And I just wonder what sort of timeframes we might have so that our noise policy matches the health impact that noise is now thought to have.
Don't really want to talk about Zoom too much, other than to say that Skype clearly dropped the ball. I think at the risk of quoting Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you lose really when you start adopting these different technologies. So yes, the advance in personal video conferencing has been a massive advantage in dealing with the pandemic and working at home and so on. And maybe that's encouraged us to work more at home. And we're not entirely sure yet what you lose by not being in the office. So I think with all of these things, it will take some time to tell, but yeah, Zoom's great.
So I've done that thing where I forget the questions again, but I know the second half was timeframes for IGCBN. So we've published we've published two reports, 2 peer-reviewed papers and a conference paper already, which are sort of gathering evidence, not work that DEFRA's commissioned, not done itself, I would hasten to add. I'm not going to take other people's credit. We're now writing a report with our recommendations, but we've not covered every noise source and every health outcome yet, because as you said, it is a huge program of work. So it will be an update of this is what we found so far, this is what we recommend, and this is the work still to do. And like I said, we've already published this stuff because we're trying to be as open as possible and get everything out into the public domain, and that's the plan going forward as well. Time frame, we're drafting the report right now. I was supposed to be getting it out by Christmas. It's not going to be out by Christmas, but within the next quarter, hopefully. Touch wood. Big caveat.
The other part of that was about what differences the evaluation, the actual monetary evaluations would make.
Yeah, so there's a system at the moment. The IGCBN made recommendations in the past. Cerise mentioned Treasury's Green Book. That's the method for doing cost benefit analysis for all major infrastructure projects. Department of Transport have a tool called WebTag, Transport Analysis Guidance. The methodologies in the Treasury's Green Book and in WebTag came from the previous IGCBN recommendations. So the hope is very much that both those tools will pick up the recommendations of the new IGCBN. And I think the impact will be that we're aware of more health outcomes. There's more evidence that can actually quantify those outcomes, as opposed to it just being something that we know. So we can put monetary value on these things. So my feeling is that the cost of noise will grow because there's more things being assessed. That then makes the cost benefit equation of some mitigation or intervention that people are looking at putting in more palatable and more economically viable. So I think that's what will happen, but until we get the programme of work finished, it's hard to say for sure.
Well, thanks very much for that. I think it has been transformative in most environmental areas to be able to put monetary values on things. It certainly transformed air quality measures, and we could see that being something that would be quite valuable. I was fascinated to see that you have both negative and positive effects of soundscapes on people's health. So we're working in a more complex area there, I think. If there are any other questions, if not, I had a question for Sarah Moller, which fascinated me, your presentation. And I wondered to what extent it was as it were, the outcomes of the exercise that gave you the best benefits, or whether it was actually the process itself, whether the process itself hasn't already transformed how DEFRA might be thinking about some of these very big issues.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that DEFRA reflected, was that actually being involved in the project has allowed them to use findings from the project in things that they're doing already. And I think by involving them in the project, they get more learning from it than they would if they were just seeing the outputs. And I think that's something that we need to reflect in the protocol we're developing, because obviously we've run this with certain groups of stakeholders, but it's in order to design a protocol that people will use to take this into other forums. And so I think one of the reflections in that needs to be that actually the learnings of the people in the room and the changes in perception, the changes in values, the changes in the ways that they look at problems and interventions is arguably as important as any report that comes out of that.
Yes, well, thank you. I would have suspected that, but that's very nice to hear that, and it'll be fascinating to see how DEFRA actually takes that forward, and how the other stakeholders that you've involved managed to assimilate those kind of insights that they've got during the exercise into their own work. So I think that's something that is going to do perhaps what Foresight failed to do, which is to actually have an effect on the whole system that has been involved in it. So that's all to the good. Well, I think that was a fascinating session. I mean, Tim, thanks very much for your reminders. Oh, somebody else. We've got another question. Right. Can you make it the last and quick one, because we've got to move on.
I'll make it a very quick one. Gareth Bowman, Leicester City Council. This is for Dr. Moller. In your presentation and what you've discussed afterwards about the stakeholders and the people involved in the project, I can see that they were all sort of national bodies, and they were sort of it's very interesting as from an environmental health practitioner point of view. It sort of seemed very sort of similar to sort of what my profession looks into in a lot of things, and several sort of similar professions in local government. but that no local government or local government sort of overarching bodies would seem to be involved in that. Is there any, was that just sort of the design of the project, or was that intentional?
No, I don't think that was necessarily intentional. I think local authorities was brought up at one point during the project, but there was a feeling that we could have had representation from a single local authority. And in one of the other projects I've got, because we have links to one specific local authority, we have done that. But that in this case, we sort of had the policy perspective from our national government input. And because we had actually quite small, so there was only 12 participants in each of the case studies, that we didn't want to add in sort of additional participants from that perspective. But I think perhaps you raise an important point that we need to think about in terms of the output and the people involved in the final dissemination event, because I think, like you say, the learning and the things that we're doing are just as relevant to things that might be happening in local government as they are to national government. So that's maybe something that we need to think about. So thanks for making that point.
Yes, I think that is a good point. I mean, the general presence of civil society stakeholders is something that is of great interest in the processes. The whole Clare City process of involving civil society in the governance of local air quality management has been quite a good exercise there. We heard about that in a previous conference, and obviously we'll be interested to see how the implementation and the follow through of this project involves civil society too. But yeah, again, to say thanks to everybody for participating in this section. Some interesting reflections from Tim about how and what might rebound after the pandemic, but what changes that there might be, and with some cautions about jumping to conclusions too quickly. Some very nice updates on what is happening in the soundscape of the United Kingdom and how that's going to be transformed as new methods of analysis and emerge, and as the new legislative program rolls out. And I think a really inspiring piece from Sarah about the way in which the government now is taking a very, very sophisticated view of how it will think about risk and manage it in future, and with, I think, some pretty fascinating illustrations. So that's been very good, and thank you also for your very good questions.